Marlowe slowly walked to the center of the stage, her wheelchair left behind in the front row. Her white dress flowed in the spotlight. "Mr. Rieu, can God hear music?" The bow fell silent. The orchestra stopped. André froze. The question rippled through the crowd like a wave. Bellamy, her mother in the middle of the audience, covered her mouth with her hand. People looked at each other in disbelief. Rieu didn't answer with words. Instead, he closed his eyes, raised his violin and played a single note. And in that moment, no one could hold back their tears. 3 months earlier, Marlowe had been sitting in her hospital bed in Boston, surrounded by drawings of angels playing violins. She was 6 years old, but in her eyes lay a wisdom that seemed much older, the kind of wisdom that only comes from long nights in hospitals and conversations with doctors, speaking in voices too quiet. "Mum," she said one morning as Bellamy brought her breakfast, "if I can hear music, can God hear it too?" Bellamy paused mid-setting down the tray. It wasn't the first time Marlowe had asked such questions. In the past 6 months, her daughter had repeatedly asked about heaven, about angels, about whether pain stops after this life. But this question was different. "Of course he can, sweetheart," Bellamy answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "But how do you know?" Bellamy sat down next to the bed. Her shift at the hospital would start in an hour. She worked in the same unit where Marlowe was being treated. That meant she never lost sight of her daughter. "Because," she said slowly, searching for words a 7-year-old would understand, but that also contained truth. "Music is the language that goes beyond words. If something is that beautiful, it must reach heaven." Marlowe thought about this for a long time, her small fingers playing with the edge of her blanket. "But I want to know. I want to really know." It was Caspian, her 12-year-old brother, who suggested the idea later that day. He came by after school, still wearing his backpack. His face showed worry, but he tried to be brave, as big brothers should be. "Marlowe," he said, "why don't you ask someone who knows more about music than Mum?" "Like who?" "Like André Rieu, for example." Marlowe's face lit up for the first time in days. She had watched André Rieu's concerts hundreds of times on the tablet the hospital had given her. His music was the only thing that calmed her during difficult nights, the only thing that could make her forget where she was. "But how would I ever ask him?" she said, her enthusiasm fading. "We'll find a way," Caspian promised, though he himself had no idea how. That evening, while Marlowe slept, Bellamy sat in the nurses' station with Jessamine, a volunteer who had worked at the hospital for 10 years. Jessamine was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a network of contacts she'd built over years of fundraising and charity work. "She's asking about God and music," Bellamy said, exhaustion clear in her voice, "and I don't know how to help her." Jessamine was silent for a moment, thinking. "There's a concert next month in Boston. André Rieu. Tickets are impossibly expensive, and even if we had them, Marlowe would be too weak to—" "Let me make some calls," Jessamine interrupted. "No promises, but let me try." What Bellamy didn't know was that Jessamine had already gone to work before the conversation ended. She knew someone at the Rieu Foundation who had helped with requests for sick children before. 2 weeks later, Jessamine entered the room with news that would change everything. "Oh, we have tickets," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Front row seats, transportation is arranged, and medical staff will be nearby, just in case." Bellamy started crying before Jessamine could finish. Marlowe, who had heard the conversation from her bed, smiled broadly for the first time in weeks. "I can ask him," she whispered. "I can finally ask him." But what no one knew, not Bellamy, not Jessamine, not even Caspian, was that Marlowe wasn't just planning to ask. She had a plan so bold, so unexpected, that it would turn the entire evening into something no one would ever forget. The weeks before the concert flew by. Marlowe's treatments became more intense, her good days rarer. But every evening she practiced what she would say, whispering the words in the darkness of her hospital bed. "Mr. Rieu, can God hear music?" She tried it different ways, sometimes as a question, sometimes as a statement. But it never felt quite right, never as if it could capture the depth of what she wanted to know. One evening, a week before the concert, Rue, an elderly woman who volunteered as a hospital chaplain, visited Marlowe's room. She had heard about the girl who was asking questions that most adults didn't dare to ask. "Marlowe," Rue said, sitting down next to the bed, "I heard you want to meet André Rieu, that you want to ask him something about God and music." Marlowe nodded. "Everyone says God hears everything, but no one can tell me how. And if music is so important, if it makes people happy and keeps sad people from crying, then surely God can hear it." Rue felt her heart break and swell at the same time. "What do you think?" she asked gently. "I think," Marlowe said slowly, "if he couldn't hear the music, it wouldn't be so beautiful. But I want to be sure, because if he hears it, he'll also hear me, and that means I'm not alone. In that moment, Rieu understood this was more than childish curiosity. This was a girl grappling with existential questions that most people don't face until adulthood. Questions about meaning, about connection, about whether there was something greater than the pain of this moment. "Marlowe," she said quietly, "whatever you do at that concert, whatever you ask, it will be important, not just for you, but for everyone who hears it." How do you know? Because real questions are always important, especially the ones we're afraid to ask. The day of the concert dawned with a mixture of excitement and fear. Bellamy had barely slept. She worried that Marlowe would be too weak, that the journey would be too exhausting, that something would go wrong. But when she entered Marlowe's room, her daughter was already awake, staring out the window at the rising sun. "Are you ready?" Bellamy asked. "I've been ready for this moment my whole life," Marlowe answered, and there was something in her voice, a determination, a peace, that made Bellamy realize her daughter knew exactly what she was doing. Boston's Symphony Hall had transformed into a sea of lights as evening fell over the city. Thousands of people streamed in, their voices mixing into an excited murmur of anticipation. But for Marlowe, sitting in a special wheelchair in the front row, it was as if the whole world had disappeared. She saw only the stage, only the place where André Rieu would perform. Bellamy sat next to her, holding Marlowe's hand, perhaps too tightly. On Marlowe's other side sat Caspian, nervously fiddling with his program. "Are you nervous?" he whispered to his sister. "No," Marlowe said, and it was true. She wasn't nervous, just calm and certain about what she would do. "But what if you can't reach him? What if security stops you?" "Then I'll find another way." Jessamine, sitting behind them, leaned forward. "Marlowe, you don't have to do this. We can try to go backstage after the concert. We can—" "It's not the same," Marlowe interrupted. "It has to be during the music. It has to be when everyone is listening." Before anyone could respond, the lights dimmed and the audience burst into applause. André Rieu appeared on stage, his violin in hand, his usual broad smile lighting up the room. "Good evening, Boston," he called out, and the audience cheered back. The concert began with a lively waltz, followed by classical favorites the audience knew and loved. But Marlowe sat motionless, waiting. She knew that André always paused mid-concert to speak with the audience, to tell stories. That would be her moment. 30 minutes into the concert, André paused. He lowered his violin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "before we continue, I want to take a moment to remember why we're all here. Music is more than notes and rhythm. It is—" He suddenly stopped. His gaze fell on something in the front row. Marlowe had stood up from her wheelchair laboriously. Her legs trembled with effort, but she stood. Slowly and deliberately she walked toward the stage. Bellamy jumped up to stop her, but Jessamine grabbed her arm. "Let her go," she whispered. "This is why we're here." Security moved forward, but André raised his hand. "Wait," he said into his microphone, his voice echoing through the entire hall. "Let her come." The crowd fell silent. Thousands of pairs of eyes followed the small girl in the white dress as she slowly climbed the stairs. It was clear she was struggling. Each step seemed a victory, an act of pure willpower. But she kept going, step by step, until she stood before André Rieu. He knelt down to be at eye level with her. "Hello, little one. What's your name?" "Marlowe." "That's a beautiful name. What can I do for you, Marlowe?" Symphony Hall was now so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Everyone leaned forward, waiting for what the girl would say. Marlowe looked André directly in the eyes. Her voice was clear and determined. "Mr. Rieu, can God hear music?" The question hung in the air like a living thing. André froze. His smile gave way to an expression of pure astonishment. Behind him, the orchestra came to a standstill. Every member was captivated by the situation. In the audience, Bellamy began to cry. Caspian gripped the armrest of his chair so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Jessamine covered her mouth with her hand, shocked by the directness, the purity of the question. André looked at the small girl, saw the seriousness in her eyes, the depth of her need to know. He realized this wasn't a philosophical question for her. This was a personal, existential question, the kind of question a life depended on. He opened his mouth to answer, but closed it again. Words suddenly seemed completely inadequate for what this question demanded. Instead, he slowly stood up, turned to his orchestra, and gave a signal no one understood. He raised his violin, placed it under his chin, and began to play. The melody that emerged was unlike anything he had ever played before. It wasn't a familiar piece, no written composition. It came from a place deeper than technique or training. It came from the soul. The notes floated through Symphony Hall like living beings. Each one carried a meaning that words could never reach. It was love and loss, hope and pain, question and answer, all in one. Marlowe closed her eyes and smiled. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sorrow. "He's listening now, isn't he?" she whispered, so softly that only André heard. He nodded, his eyes now red. He continued playing, building the melody to a climax so beautiful, so pure that it physically hurt to listen to it. Something remarkable happened in the audience. One by one, people started to cry, not discreetly, not suppressed, but openly, without shame. Grown men wept, women held each other, children stared at their parents with wide eyes, wondering why everyone seemed sad. But it wasn't sadness, it was something else. It was the feeling of touching something sacred, something greater than the moment itself. When the last note faded, there was silence. André and Marlowe stood facing each other on stage, and for a single moment, it seemed as if they were the only two people in the universe. "Thank you," Marlowe finally said, her voice barely audible. "That was the answer I needed." André knelt again and embraced her gently, as if she were made of glass. "No," he whispered in her ear, "you gave me the answer." The audience finally burst into applause, but it was different from ordinary concert applause. It was reverence, respect, the recognition that they had just experienced something that changed their understanding of music, of connection, of the divine. Backstage after the concert, there was a small room where Marlowe could rest before returning to the hospital. Bellamy sat next to her, still crying, still trying to understand what had just happened. "Why didn't you tell me what you were planning?" she asked, her voice gentle but emotional. "Because you would have tried to stop me," Marlowe answered honestly. "Out of love, out of worry. But I had to do it, Mom. I had to know. And now that you know," Marlowe smiled, a peace on her face that Bellamy hadn't seen in months. "Now, I'm not afraid anymore." There was a soft knock on the door, and Rieu entered. She had watched the entire concert from the balcony, witnessing her young friend direct her question to the world. "Marlowe," she said quietly, "can I show you something?" She pulled out an envelope, old, wrinkled, as if it had been opened and closed many times. "What is that?" Caspian asked, also in the room. "A letter," Rieu said, "that Marlowe gave me last week. She asked me to only open it if she really went through with her plan." She handed the letter to Bellamy, who opened it with trembling hands. Inside, in Marlowe's childish handwriting, were words that broke and healed Bellamy's heart. "Dear Mum, if you're reading this, I asked my question. I know you were scared, but I had to do it. Not because I don't believe God listens, but because I wanted everyone else to know. Sometimes people forget that beautiful things reach heaven. They're so caught up in their problems that they forget to look up. So I asked, and I knew Mr. Rieu would answer. Not with words, but with music, because that's the only way to answer such big questions. Now everyone who was there knows. They felt it, and that means, when I'm ever scared, I can remember that I'm not alone, that God is always listening. I love you, Mom." Marlowe Bellamy pressed the letter to her chest, her body shaking with sobs. Caspian sat down next to her and hugged her tightly. "She's incredible," he whispered. "My little sister is incredible." There was another knock, and this time it was André Rieu himself who entered. He had waited until Marlowe had rested a bit, but he still had something to say to her. "Marlowe," he said, kneeling to her level, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. That melody I played, it came from nowhere. I had never played it before, never heard it before, but while I was playing, it felt like someone else was guiding me. Do you know what I mean?" Marlowe nodded wisely. "That was the answer. God let you play what he wanted me to hear." André felt goosebumps all over his body. "How did you know that would happen?" "I didn't know, but I hoped. Because if music is the language of heaven, like you always say, then there must be a way to answer." That evening, as Bellamy took Marlowe back to the hospital, Jessamine told them something remarkable. "The moment is already online," she said, showing her phone. "It was filmed, and it's spreading everywhere." Bellamy watched the video, her daughter walking onto the stage asking the question, André playing that impossible melody. The comments were pouring in. Thousands of people were moved by what they had seen. "She'll be famous," Caspian said half-jokingly. But Marlowe shook her head. "It's not about me, it's about the question. Now people are thinking about it. That's what matters." The next morning, Bellamy was awakened by the incessant ringing of her phone. Messages from friends, family, even people she barely knew. They had all seen the video. They all wanted to say something. "She's an angel," someone wrote. "This question changed my faith," wrote another. Schools across America began using the clip in philosophy, religion, and music classes. Teachers asked students, "If you could ask God one question, what would it be?" And everywhere, in homes across Boston, New York, Los Angeles, and beyond, people began thinking about questions they had avoided, postponed. Parents talked with their children about faith in ways they never had before. Couples discussed the big questions of life that had been buried under everyday worries. Friends shared their deepest doubts and hopes. "Do you see what you did?" Caspian asked his sister one evening. "I just asked a question." "Exactly, and that was enough." Churches across America used the clip. Pastors played it during services and spoke about it in their sermons. Some called it a moment of divine connection. "That sounds so grand," Marlowe said, a little overwhelmed. "And it is," Rieu replied, "but it came from a simple, honest question. That's where the power lies." André Rieu declined all interviews about that moment. When reporters tried to reach him after concerts, he only said, "Some moments are too sacred to analyze. Just let it be." But he did do something else. At the end of every concert, no matter where he played, Paris, London, Vienna, Tokyo, he ended with the same melody. That indescribable, unrepeatable melody he had played for Marlowe. People tried to write it down, to guess the notes. Musicians sat for hours at their instruments trying to reconstruct it, but no one got it right. So it was as if the melody could only exist in that one moment, with that one question. "It didn't come from him," Marlowe said when Bellamy told her about the attempts. "It came through him. That's something different." 2 weeks after the concert, Marlowe began to weaken. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the slow, inevitable progression that Bellamy had feared since the diagnosis. She spent more time in bed, her energy fading with each day. But strangely, she seemed more peaceful than ever. "Mom," she said one morning, "I'm getting tired." "I know, sweetheart. I see it. It's the music." "The answer." Bellamy nodded, unable to speak because of the lump in her throat. She sat down on the bed next to Marlowe and stroked her hair, just like when Marlowe was a baby. Some things never change, she thought. A mother's need to comfort her child, to protect, even when protection is no longer possible. "Mom, can I tell you something?" Marlowe asked after a long silence. "Of course, sweetheart, anything. Since that night on stage, I've been having dreams, but not scary dreams like before. Beautiful dreams." "What kind of dreams?" Marlowe's eyes took on a distant look, as if seeing something Bellamy couldn't see. "I dream I'm in a great hall, bigger than Symphony Hall, and there's music everywhere. Not just violin music, but all kinds. Pianos, flutes, voices singing in languages I don't know but I understand anyway." Bellamy felt her heart constrict. "It sounds beautiful." "It's more than beautiful, Mum. It's perfect. Like all the music that was ever made comes together there. And in that dream I don't feel any pain. I feel light, like I could fly if I wanted to." "Marlowe, and you know what's most beautiful? In those dreams I see that God doesn't just listen to music. He dances to it. He's part of it. The music comes from him and returns to him like breathing." Bellamy began to cry silently, trying not to show it. But Marlowe noticed anyway. "Don't cry, Mum. These dreams make me happy. They show me where I'm going." Caspian came every day after school, bringing his homework so he could sit with his sister. They talked less now. Words didn't seem as important anymore, but the connection between them was stronger than ever. One afternoon, when Marlowe seemed particularly alert, she turned to her brother with a question that surprised him. "Caspian, what do you want to be when you grow up?" He hadn't expected this question. "Not now. Not here." "I don't know. I thought maybe an engineer or—" "No," she interrupted gently. "I don't mean what job, I mean what kind of person." Caspian thought for a long time. "I think I want to be someone who helps others, like you did." "I didn't help anyone. I just asked a question." "But that's exactly what people need, Marlowe. Someone who asks the questions they're afraid to ask. Someone who shows them it's okay not to have all the answers." Marlowe smiled, for a moment, seeming like the energetic girl she once was. "Caspian, promise me something. Anything. Keep listening to music, not just because it's beautiful, but because it's a way to connect with other people, with yourself, with everything that's greater. I promise. And one more thing. If you ever feel lonely, scared, or lost, listen to that melody. That melody Mr. Rieu played, because in those notes is everything I wanted to tell you but never found the words for." Caspian held her hand tightly. "I'll listen every day." André Rieu visited the hospital once, quietly and unnoticed by the media. He came after hours, accompanied only by Jessamine, who led him through the empty corridors to Marlowe's room. When he entered, Bellamy was sitting in the chair next to the bed, half asleep from exhaustion. Marlowe was awake, looking at the door as if she had known he would come. "Hello, Marlowe," he said softly. "Mr. Rieu." Her face lit up despite her weakness. "I knew you'd come. I had to thank you." "For what?" "For asking the question I should have asked my whole life. For reminding me why I make music." He set down his violin case and opened it. "May I play for you? One last time?" Marlowe nodded eagerly, her eyes shining with anticipation. Bellamy was awakened by the sound and wanted to get up, but André motioned for her to stay seated. "This is for both of you," he said. for mother and daughter, who taught me more than a lifetime of concerts." André began to play. Not the melody from that evening at Symphony Hall, but something new, something that felt like a continuation of that conversation. It was gentler, more intimate, a song just for them. The notes moved through the room like a gentle promise. Each one carried a message of hope and connection. As he played, Bellamy felt the music fill the room with more than just sound. It was as if the air itself vibrated with meaning, as if every molecule was transformed by the purity of what André was playing. Marlowe closed her eyes and smiled. "He's listening," she whispered, "and now I can almost see him." André didn't stop playing, but his eyes became moist. He had played for kings, for presidents, for millions of people around the world. But this moment, this quiet, intimate moment in a hospital room, was perhaps the most important performance of his entire career. When the last chord faded, he sat quietly for a moment. "Marlowe, because of you, thousands, maybe millions, will hear music differently. They'll understand it's more than entertainment. It's a connection to the divine." "That's beautiful," she said simply. "Because that's what it always was. I just asked what everyone already knew, but we forget." André placed his hand on her forehead, such a tender gesture that Bellamy began to cry again. "You're wiser than I'll ever be," he said. "That's because I had a whole life to learn." "Children still know how to ask," Marlowe said. "Adults forget it's okay not to have all the answers." "Marlowe," André said, his voice now soft and full of emotion, "can I ask you one more thing?" "Of course. That evening at Symphony Hall, when you asked that question, did you expect the answer? Did you know what I would do?" Marlowe thought for a long time before answering. "I didn't know exactly what you would do, but I knew if anyone could give the answer, it was you. Because you understand that some questions are too big for words. They need music." André wiped a tear from his eye. "You gave me a gift that night, the gift of remembering. I had forgotten that music isn't about perfection, technique, or even beauty. It's about truth, and your question was the most truthful I've ever heard." "Will you keep playing that melody?" Marlowe asked. "That melody you played for me?" "At every concert, forever." "Good, because then the question will live on, and as long as it lives, people will keep thinking about it. And that's all I wanted." On Marlowe's last day, the family gathered in her room. Bellamy on one side, Caspian on the other, both holding her hands. Rieu sat at the foot of the bed, praying silently. Jessamine stood at the door, her presence a quiet support. The room was filled with a peace no one could explain. There was sadness, deep, piercing sadness, of course, but there was something else, a feeling of fullness, of completeness, as if Marlowe's short life had been exactly as it should have been. "Play the music," Marlowe whispered, her voice so soft it was barely audible. Caspian started the recording on his phone. The volume was low but audible. The melody filled the small room, that impossible, unforgettable melody born in a moment, but would live forever. Marlowe listened, her breathing slow but peaceful. "Do you hear him?" she whispered. "He's listening." "We hear him, sweetheart," Bellamy said through tears. "Good, because that means you're never alone. Where there's music, there's connection. Where there's connection, there's God." Those were Marlowe's last words. She closed her eyes while the melody continued to play, a smile on her face, so full of peace that it seemed almost impossible she had ever experienced pain. Bellamy held her tightly, feeling the moment her daughter transitioned from this life to the next. It wasn't dramatic or frightening. It was as natural as breathing, as gentle as daylight fading into dusk. "She's free," Rieu whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's finally free. And now she's dancing to the music she heard in her dreams." Caspian said nothing, couldn't say anything. He just held Marlowe's hand, feeling the warmth slowly fade, and listened to the melody his sister had loved so much. And in that music he felt that she wasn't gone, but transformed, freed from pain and fear, finally able to dance again, as she had always wished. Marlowe's funeral was held in a small church in Boston. It was an intimate celebration, just family and close friends, exactly as Bellamy had wanted. But outside stood hundreds of people, strangers who had heard Marlowe's story and had come to pay their last respects. During the service, André Rieu played live, not the melody he had played for Marlowe, but something new, something that felt like a tribute to her short but impactful life. It wasn't sad music, but music full of light and hope. Music that spoke of beginnings instead of endings. When the last notes of mourning faded, everyone stood, not to applaud, but in silence, hands on hearts. A shared moment of reverence for a girl who had dared to ask what no one else dared to ask. Bellamy spoke briefly, her voice strong despite her sadness. "My daughter taught me that asking questions is an act of faith, that being honest about our doubts doesn't separate us from God, but brings us closer to Him. And that music, beautiful, honest music, is the bridge we can all use when words aren't enough. She paused, her gaze moving over the faces before her. Marlowe didn't want you to be sad. She wanted you to ask questions, to be honest, to listen to music, to each other, to the silence where God dwells. And if you do that, somehow she'll still be with you. Caspian read a letter he had written to his sister, promising to keep her question alive, to continue encouraging people to courageously seek truth. His voice broke several times, but he kept going, driven by the promise he had made to Marlowe. "You taught me," he read, "that being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means loving despite fear, asking despite uncertainty, believing despite doubt. And I promise you, sister, I'll keep asking, for you, for myself, for everyone who's too afraid to do it themselves." André Rieu, the hospital chaplain who had known Marlowe so well, closed with a blessing that felt as if it came directly from the child herself. May we all have the courage to ask our questions. May we believe we are heard. And may we listen to music, not just with our ears but with our souls, because in that music, in that beautiful divine music, we find connection to everything holy. The clip of Marlowe's question was viewed over 20 million times. It was translated into dozens of languages, used in hundreds of churches and schools, quoted in philosophical discussions and theological debates. But for Bellamy, Caspian, and everyone who knew Marlowe, it was never about the views or the fame. It was always about the question itself and the answer André Rieu had given, not with words but with music. André Rieu founded the Marlowe Arts Foundation, dedicated to bringing music to sick children in hospitals throughout America. Every time he plays for these children, he tells Marlowe's story, not to mythologize her, but to remind them that their questions matter, that their voices are heard. Bellamy still works as a nurse in the same hospital, but now with a new perspective. She speaks openly with families about faith and doubt. She uses Marlowe's example to help them ask their own questions. "My daughter taught me," she often tells them, "that the best questions are the ones we're afraid to ask, because they touch the truth." Caspian now studies music therapy, inspired by his sister's ability to create more connection in a moment of music than 1,000 words could have done. He works part-time in the hospital where Marlowe was treated, using music to help children ask their own questions and find their own answers. And at every concert, everywhere in the world, when André Rieu plays that special melody, the melody that has no name, that can't be written down, that can only be felt, people look up and remember a girl who dared to ask, "Can God hear music?" And in the silence that follows, in the time between the last note and the first applause, they all believe, if only for a moment, that the answer is yes, always yes.